10-minute or less lecture series, Human Anatomy, Chapter 24, the Digestive System, Part 2. So, moving on from the stomach, we have some accessory organs in the abdominal cavity that are very important. For instance, we have the pancreas, which is posterior or behind the stomach, and it stretches from the spleen to the duodenum, which is the beginning portion of the small intestines. It has a head, a body, and a tail. It has a large pancreatic duct, which leads to an opening leading to the duodenum. The pancreatic duct will, right at the very end, form a common duct with the common bile duct that comes from the liver and gallbladder to form the hepatopancreatic ampulla, which ends in the hepatopancreatic sphincter. The accessory duct of the pancreas also leads to the duodenum by a slightly different route. Pancreas produces pancreatic juice, which is slightly alkaline to neutralize the high acidity of the gastric juice in the chyme. This also inactivates enzymes that need a highly acidic environment to function. It releases a variety of digestive enzymes, including pancreatic amylase, that breaks down carbohydrates, trypsin, chymotrypsin, carboxypeptidase, and elastase that breaks down proteins, pancreatic lipase that digests fats, and ribonuclease and deoxyribonuclease that breaks down nucleic acids. Turns out that most of the chemical digestion of food occurs in the small intestine. Pancreas, inflammation of the pancreas is called pancreatitis. It can be very painful. And then pancreatic cancer is, of course, cancer in the pancreas. Often is not detected until after it's metastasized and almost always fatal. The liver and the gallbladder. Liver is primarily in the upper right quadrant of the abdominal cavity, directly inferior to the diaphragm. And on the inferior surface of the liver is the gallbladder. Liver has four lobes: the very large right lobe, the left lobe, the caudate lobe near the inferior vena cava, and the quadrate lobe near the gallbladder. It attaches to the anterior abdominal wall by the falciform ligament and from the diaphragm via the coronary ligaments. There is the common hepatic duct, which leaves the liver transporting bile. This will fuse with the cystic duct coming from the gallbladder to form the common bile duct that then carries the bile down to the hepatopancreatic ampulla and sphincter. So it goes into the duodenum. There are lots of blood vessels associated with the liver. There's the hepatic artery, which arrives with oxygenated blood. There's a hepatic portal vein, which comes from the small intestine carrying blood rich in nutrients. And again, since this hepatic portal vein is connecting two sets of capillaries, that's why it's called a portal vein. And then finally, there's the hepatic vein, which takes the blood from the liver into the inferior vena cava. Gallbladder. Gallbladder stores bile. That's the only thing it does. And then it releases bile through the cystic duct into the common bile duct. As mentioned before, the common bile duct fuses with the pancreatic duct to form the hepatopancreatic ampulla, which then releases its contents through the hepatopancreatic sphincter into the duodenum. So that is the route it takes. Gallstones. Gallstones crystallize cholesterol that can partly or completely obstruct bile flow through the gallbladder. It can be a very painful chronic condition that sometimes needs to be resolved by the removal of the gallbladder via a cholecystectomy. Liver is a very intricate organ. It has lots and lots of hepatocytes, liver cells that produce bile, as well as doing many other things. They get arranged in rows running along these hepatic sinusoids, which are very permeable blood capillaries. This then allows the hepatocytes to pull out nutrients and toxins and so forth from the blood arriving from the small intestine. The hepatocytes, when they produce bile, will secrete it into tiny, tiny microscopic bile caniculi, which then will eventually fuse and so on to lead to the hepatic ducts, carrying the bile toward the duodenum. The portal triad is when you have a bile duct next to a branch of the hepatic artery, next to a branch of the hepatic portal vein. And you see this reoccurring throughout the liver, which is why it gets a special name, the portal triad. So, oxygenated blood and nutrient-rich blood arrives and mixes in the liver sinusoids and goes to the central vein running throughout the liver, which then lead to hepatic vein, inferior vena cava, etc. Functions in the liver: synthesis, secretion of bile. Bile emulsifies lipids. It breaks down big globules of lipids into teeny tiny globules of lipids that make them easier to be absorbed and or broken down by enzymes. Think of what soap does. Carbohydrate metabolism maintains normal blood glucose levels, can break down or produce glycogen, which is a long molecule made up of glucose molecules. Lipid metabolism, it stores triglycerides and can break them down into fatty acids. It controls cholesterol levels. Protein metabolism, it deaminates amino acids, can convert them into glucose or into other kinds of amino acids, and leads to production of urea, which is a waste product that is sent into the bloodstream. Can process drugs and hormones, excrete bilirubin into bile, store things like glycogen, triglycerides, vitamins, and minerals. Phagocytosis, they're specialized stellar reticuloendothelial cells in the hepatic sinusoids, which will engage in phagocytic activities engulfing pathogens. And it is also involved in the production and activation of vitamin D. Hepatitis is just inflammation of the liver. It can be from drugs, chemicals, viruses, etc. Usually we think of it in terms of viral infections. And there are a variety of viruses that can do this, hepatitis A through E. All right, moving on now to the small intestine. Small intestine is basically in all four quadrants of the abdominal cavity, longest portion. It is the longest portion of the gastrointestinal tract where most of the chemical digestion and most of the absorption of nutrients occurs. It has three main regions: the very short duodenum, which is short C-shaped turn of the small intestine that comes directly after the stomach. Then the jejunum, about 3 feet long, primarily in the upper left quadrant, and then the ileum, about 6 feet long, mostly in the lower right quadrant. And it ends in the ileocecal sphincter that then controls the passage of materials from the small intestine to the large intestine. Histologically, the mucosa of the small intestine has a lot of alterations to what is expected. There are a lot of circular folds of the submucosa and mucosal layers pushing out into the lumen. These folds are then covered in these smaller finger-like projections called the villi, and they are important structures that are lined with simple columnar epithelium. And then these cells, these simple columnar epithelial cells, have microvilli on their apical surface. And the whole point of all of this is to increase surface area in order to increase absorption of nutrients from the materials in the lumen of the small intestine. Between the villi are intestinal glands. Intestinal glands mostly producing water, a few digestive enzymes, primarily to keep the chyme nice and liquidy. There are also within the villi, you have lacteals, which is the part of the lymphatic system that carries absorbed lipids. So our lipids are carried in the lymph vessels called lacteals, while the rest of the nutrients go straight into the bloodstream. There are a variety of different cells that line the mucosal layer. There's the absorptive cells, which are the simple columnar epithelial cells with microvilli that will absorb the various nutrients. On their plasma membrane, they have a lot of what are called brush border enzymes that complete the chemical digestive process. There are also lots of goblet cells that produce mucus. Mucus is very important, helps lubricate the lining of the small intestine so materials can pass along. There are also enteroendocrine cells that produce a variety of hormones that are important for stimulating or suppressing various regions of the gastrointestinal tract. And then there's the Paneth cells that secrete lysozyme that is an antimicrobial agent, and the Paneth cells are actually also capable of phagocytosis in case any pathogens try to invade through the intestinal pits. The other layers, the mucosa, muscularis, and serosa, are basically as expected. Function in small intestine, complete the chemical digestion process of all the various macromolecules we need. Segmentation, this is localized mixing, where contractions just sort of move the contents of the small intestine back and forth, back and forth, back and forth. Peristalsis, to move the entire material along the length of the small intestine. Usually it's pretty slow, but there's even slower version that's called migratory motility complex. And of course, lots of absorption. About 90% of the nutrients and water are absorbed into the small intestine. That brings us to the large intestine. Large intestine primarily wraps around the abdominal cavity, as you see here, and its inferior portions go into the pelvic cavity. The very first compartment of the large intestine is called the cecum. It is directly after the ileocecal sphincter, which controls the passage of stuff from the ileum into the cecum. The appendix hangs off of the cecum. Then you have the ascending colon going up the right side of the abdomen. When it reaches the liver, it makes a left turn called the right colic flexure. Then you have the transverse colon that continues across the abdomen, and when it reaches the end of the abdominal cavity, it will then form a 90-degree turn called the left colic flexure. And then you have the descending colon going down the left side of the abdominal cavity until it gets to about the level of the iliac crest. Then it'll be this sort of S-shaped or curved structure called the sigmoid colon, which basically ends up going toward the midline and then dipping down into the pelvic cavity, where we have the rectum, which is about the last 8 inches of the gastrointestinal tract. It ends in the anal canal. That is then followed by the anus proper. And the anus has two anal sphincters, an internal anal sphincter and an external anal sphincter. Function of the large intestine, haustral churning, so the material is being moved back and forth between haustra. Haustra is these individual pouches of the large intestine. Peristalsis to move it along the large intestine, and mass peristalsis to move it quickly along the large intestine. Large intestine also has many varieties of bacteria, which are very useful and helpful for us. They can do things like convert some amino acids into other kinds of amino acids, break down amino acids, produce some vitamins that are important, some of the vitamin B vitamins and vitamin K. They also get absorption of water, ions, electrolytes, some vitamins. The feces is formed, and then, of course, defecation, releasing the undigested material. Large intestine's histology is pretty basic. The mucosal layer relatively smooth, although it does have intestinal glands that produce some water and especially mucus to allow materials to continue to move along the large intestine without damaging it. Then the submucosa, muscularis, and serosal layers are all as expected. Running along the length of the large intestine is the strips of smooth muscle tissue called the tinea coli. They are rather thick in bands, and their contractions form these little pouches called the haustra for many, haustrum for one. Disorders associated with the large intestine, diarrhea, which is the increase in frequency, volume, and fluid of content of feces, constipation, difficulty or infrequency in defecating. Since the feces stays in the large intestine longer, it becomes very dry and hard as the water is being absorbed out of it. And then a very serious issue, colorectal cancer, which can be extremely deadly. However, it can be detected early in the form of palps, which are precancerous growths, which then can be removed and in order to avoid the cancer developing. Hope that was helpful. Be sure to subscribe and like below.